Hello, my name is Melissa Peterson, and I am the site manager of the Charles Lindbergh House and Museum in Little Falls, Minnesota. Today, I want to share with you what made Charles A. Lindbergh the most famous man in the world in 1927. On May 21st, he completed his first nonstop solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. How many of you have read about airplanes? Seen books or photographs of airplanes, or even flown on a plane yourself? So many things in our lives rely on air travel, but when Charles was young, things were very different. Charles's flight was important to the world because it proved the safety of flying. Prior to Lindbergh's flight, aviation was seen as a dangerous activity. On average, 1 out of every 6 airmail pilots died while flying. Few people saw aviation as part of the world's transportation system. Instead, they relied on ships, trains, and automobiles to transport people and other items across the United States and the world. Instead, aviation was limited to as something for entertainment. Have you ever heard of an air show? Think about the different stunts that are typically done at an air show. When Lindbergh was young, people had held similar events. They were called barnstormers, and that was Charles's very first job in aviation. Here he is in this photograph preparing his parachute because one of his tricks was to actually jump out of airplanes and perform stunts. And he would jump out of a plane like this. This is called a World War I biplane. It is nicknamed a Jenny. And barnstormers would use them to do loop-de-loos and other stunts at local fairs whenever they flew into a new community, trying to entertain folks and earn enough money to make a living. And it was there that Lindbergh really learned how to fly. And his first professional job was being an airmail pilot. And he flew between St. Louis, Missouri and Chicago, Illinois for the Robertson Aircraft Corporation. It was during his time as an airmail pilot that he learned about the Orteig Prize. A man named Raymond Orteig was offering $25,000 for the first plane to fly nonstop from New York City to Paris, France. When Lindbergh heard about this contest, he felt he was just the man to win it. Now, have you ever wanted to do something so big that others thought it might be a little bit crazy? Well, that's what a lot of people felt about Charles Lindbergh. Aviation was a useful tool because one man decided to dream big. All right, now that Lindbergh decided he wanted to enter this competition, he's going to need a few things in order to win. The first thing he needs to fly to Paris is an airplane, of course. He needs an airplane that is specifically designed to go the distance. This plane, that biplane, it's really wasn't designed to do that. But after some searching, he found the Ryan Airline Company in San Diego, California. And he had studied what the airplanes were like and what flaws caused others to fail in their attempt at the Orteig Prize, and was confident that they were able to build a custom plane that could go the distance. The main thing Lindbergh noticed in those other planes that had failed is that they were heavy and full of unnecessary equipment. When he worked with Ryan Airlines to design the Spirit of St. Louis, their first consideration was that it was efficient. The plane needed to be strong enough to carry the amount of fuel needed to fly 3,610 miles between New York and Paris, yet still be light enough to defy the laws of gravity and take off. The first thing Lindbergh decided in regards to the issue of weight was he was going to fly by himself. Most of the other people who were attempting the transatlantic flight were going in teams, and by eliminating a second pilot, Lindbergh would save 350 pounds. And he said, quote, "I would rather have extra gasoline than an extra man," end quote. Charles was very deliberate in his choices about what he would bring on this trip, and he wanted to have enough items to be safe, but not so many items that it would weigh him down too much. Now, when Charles starts planning his trip to France, he needs a way to navigate over the ocean. When he flies over land, he always uses road maps to help him figure out where he's going. He used landmarks such as rivers and train tracks. It's really hard to do this over an ocean because, of course, there's no such landmarks in the giant sea of water. So he uses another method called dead reckoning in order to navigate. And dead reckoning, you need three things: a map, a compass, and a watch. Charles's map was very special. While planning this route, he chose the shortest distance between New York and Paris. If you look at a globe, the shortest distance between those two cities is a straight line, right? But since it's difficult to carry a globe around with you, we use maps. However, if you look at how the line looks on the globe compared to a flat map, you can see that it has to be translated a little bit for that different surface. And Charles uses that straight line, which looks like a curve on a flat map, and he uses a special map called a Mercator's map. And he wrote in his book, The Spirit of St. Louis, and I quote, "With the instruments that Hall loaned me, I drew a straight line between New York and Paris on the Genoic projection. And then I transferred the points from that line at 100-mile intervals onto the Mercator's projection and connected these points with straight lines. At each point, I marked down the distance from New York and the magnetic course to the next change in angle. I chose 100-mile intervals as a convenient distance to work with because with wind and cruising speed considered, it seems likely that the Spirit of St. Louis will cover about that distance each hour. I decide to lay a second route across the ocean by trigonometry. But it's not as easy to find the great circle latitudes and longitudes through logarithmic formulas as it is to pick them off a chart. Even after I learn the procedure, it takes a long time to work out each position, and there are 36 of them in all. After spending several days at this task, I reach a point in the Atlantic, 1,200 miles beyond the coast of Newfoundland. My mathematical route and my charted route coincide so closely that it seems like a waste of time to consider with the calculations. So the key things here are Charles knew that his plane would travel about 100 miles in 1 hour. And so he makes those lines, as you can see on this map here, at those intervals. And he uses his compass to calculate the reading on which angle he should be facing the Spirit of St. Louis and which travel direction he should use. And he uses that watch to time himself every hour to make those slight adjustments so he could stay en route and make sure he arrives in Paris. So the men at Ryan Airlines worked really hard, and the plane was completed in about 60 days as promised. And on May 11th, Charles left San Diego and flew to New York, making an overnight stop in St. Louis, Missouri, to thank the men who loaned him the money he needed to buy his plane. This airplane is named the Spirit of St. Louis in their honor. He crossed the country in 22 hours, and this was the fastest anyone had flown between the two coasts at that time. When Charles arrives in New York City, people don't really take him seriously as a competitor for the Orteig Prize. He's a young, unknown pilot who came in late to this competition. As a result, many people call him the Flying Fool. As you can see here in this photograph, it says "keep out," and somebody wrote "out of the water" as a joke because most people thought he was going to crash and fail in his New York to Paris attempt. In addition to being an unknown pilot, Lindbergh was the only one attempting to make a solo flight. Lindbergh knew that his plane could fly that 100 miles per hour, and it's about 3,600 miles between the two cities. So he figured it would take about 36 hours to make that flight. That's a long time to stay awake. Have you ever done that? So if you wake up in the morning, you get up on a normal day, you'd get up and go to school or to work. But first you'd have some breakfast, spend all day at school, and then come home. You'd eat your dinner, you'd stay awake all through the night to have breakfast. and then to go to school the next day. And at dinner time on the second day is about when you could go to sleep again. That's a really long time. But Lindbergh, Charles, he had an answer for all of those people who doubted his ability to stay awake for that long. He said, and I quote, "I've stayed awake for over 40 hours more than once, working pretty hard most of the time too. I don't see why I shouldn't be able to fly that long sitting down." End quote. One of the only things that earned Charles some respect from the other pilots at this point was that 22-hour cross-country trip that he made in order to get to New York City to start. But before Lindbergh could take off for Paris, he needed to pack certain equipment for the journey. He brought several items with him. He did bring an inflatable raft and a pump and a repair kit, 5 ham sandwiches, a canteen with 4 quarts of water. Concerning how little food and water Lindbergh brought, he said, and I quote, "If I get to Paris, I won't need any more. And if I don't get to Paris, I won't need any more either." End quote. He even took the time to cut the blank edges of his map off to save on weight. He had a special Ambrose cup for making fresh water from condensation, and he brought 5 cans of army rations with him, a hunting knife, a ball of cord, some string, and a large needle that could be used to make minor repairs in the fabric covering of the Spirit of St. Louis or be converted to fishing equipment. He brought a flashlight, some flares sealed in a rubber tube, and a match safe with some matches and a hacksaw blade. He did not bring a sextant for navigating by the stars because the Spirit of St. Louis wouldn't hold straight by itself. He needed to keep both hands on the stick in order to navigate. A parachute, as most of his flight would be over the ocean, would be practically useless. Where would he land if he used that? And people were not sure if a radio would have enough signal and be strong enough to be useful over the ocean. So he left those behind as well. Overall, he basically took the bare essentials with him on his flight. Remember, he's trying to save as much weight as he can on other supplies because his philosophy was if he had enough gasoline, he'd make it to Paris no problem. Unfortunately for Lindbergh and the other pilots attempting to make the transatlantic flight, there were several days of rain and bad weather that kept him grounded. As a result, some of his friends at the airfield talked Charles into trying to go see a Broadway show with them one evening. On the way to the show, Charles asked if they could stop and check the weather forecast one more time, and the forecast showed a glimmer of hope for taking off the next morning. Lindbergh decided this was too good of an opportunity. He headed straight back to the hotel and tried to get some sleep. Now, have you ever had a hard time sleeping before a big event or a trip? Well, Charles, he had the same problem. Excuse me. He was really excited and nervous about beginning his flight the next day. He got up super early after barely getting any sleep and made his preparations to take off. In this photograph here, you can see him wearing the heavy flight suit, which will keep him warm when he's flying. They loaded up 451 gallons of gasoline into the Spirit of St. Louis in order to make sure it had enough fuel to reach all the way to Paris. Now, before Lindbergh takes off on the morning of May 20th, 21st, here's a video of that takeoff. There is no sound with it. All the people gathered on the airfield around 8 o'clock in the morning. You can see how it's bouncing down the runway as it gains speed. And just barely clears those telephone lines before heading off into the unknown. Here's a photograph of the Spirit of St. Louis pretty early in its flight. And Charles flies along the coast and is later seen over Nova Scotia and Canada in the evening before venturing out across the Atlantic. Once he was over the Atlantic Ocean, he had 15 hours without contacting another person. He fought the need to sleep. He fought ice on his wings of the airplane, and he even flew without his navigation instruments working correctly when he flew through a magnetic storm. 28 hours after taking off, so about breakfast time on the second day, Charles sees Ireland. And despite the challenges of flying across the ocean, he is less than 3 miles off course. He crosses over England and the English Channel and into France. And now he's been spotted by people who begin gathering at Le Bourget Airport just outside of Paris. And he lands at about 10:30 p.m. Paris time, 33 and a half hours after taking off from New York City. Immediately, there are massive celebrations in France and around the world as people realize Lindbergh made it across the ocean. Here you can see a ticker tape parade held in New York City when he returned to the United States. And Charles successfully proved the safety of flying and put aviation in the public spotlight. A few years after his flight, Charles marries Anne Morrow, and the two of them map out air routes that we still use today. So if you've flown in an airplane, it's very likely that Charles helped establish the route that you took. These advances in aviation created an industry that we know and use today and to transport people and supplies all over the world. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, you can email us at lindbergh@mnhs.org. Thank you.